Good afternoon and welcome to another Angry Bulletin here on the Angry Astronaut. Still struggling to get over this cold at the moment, so my voice is probably going to sound a bit off, a bit froggy. Apologize for that, but have to talk about these recent developments. So many amazing things that have been happening over the course of the last 24 hours. The fact that Saxavord managed to grab yet another customer, a customer that was supposed to be competing with them actually, and a customer that's going to be introducing mid-size rockets instead of all of these micro launchers that Europe has been talking about all this time. Looks like that there's going to be a significant upgrade in Saxavord in terms of the types of rockets we can expect to see up there. All very exciting. If you haven't seen that, well, all that's going to be linked at the end of this video. But of course, what everybody's talking about is Jared Isaacman being nominated for NASA administrator. This came, I think, as a great surprise to quite a number of people, although in retrospect, it really shouldn't be that huge of a surprise because he is a pretty good choice and somebody that's been in the public eye a lot lately as quite the private astronaut, somebody that hasn't just been going up into suborbital space for a few minutes in order to get their 15 minutes of fame. This is somebody who spent days and days in orbit actually carrying out a number of relevant scientific experiments while he's been up there. So yeah, in my opinion, a good selection. Also, somebody who's known for being a humanitarian, somebody who has been really making it his life goal to try to do something about cancer, especially cancer in younger people with his crusade for St. Jude. He's raised many, many millions of dollars for that charity. So definitely an individual who has a good reputation in society at large. So just a good selection overall. But there's a big question, obviously, that comes with this nomination. Obviously, Jared and Elon are very close. They are closer than most people when it comes to their relationship, not only publicly, but also, I think, as friends as well. Elon has done a lot for Jared. Obviously, he's made it possible for him to travel to space, and sure, Jared may have paid a lot of money to do that, but at the same time, Elon contributed many millions of dollars to St. Jude in the process also, and I don't think that Elon actually realized too much of a profit out of the 2 times that Jared actually went to space. So that being the case, I think we can expect that NASA is going to be choosing, quote unquote, to go with SpaceX for a great number of applications here in the future. And the most obvious one is to simply transition away from SLS and over to Starship. Something that I have actually advocated for many years, especially in the early days on my channel, when SLS still had not yet gone to the moon, when there were real alternatives out there for getting Orion to the moon that didn't require the use of this ridiculously expensive, expendable, wasteful rocket. Something I talked about quite a bit in 2020 when Jim Bridenstine talked about options, alternatives to SLS, for example, launching Orion with Falcon Heavy, or launching Orion with another medium lift rocket, perhaps a Delta IV Heavy, something like that, docking it with a Centaur upper stage and using that to get it to the moon. He actually openly discussed these possibilities, but decided that SLS was the way to go. Here we are, 4 years later, and only now are we looking at getting rid of SLS. Now, I've already made a video about this and talked about why, after 4 years, it would really put not only Artemis, but our prospects for returning to the moon before the Chinese managed to get there in serious jeopardy if we shut SLS down at this point. But also, I think it's important for Jared Isaacman and for his legacy to decide exactly what sort of administrator he's going to be. Is he going to be his own man? Is he going to create his own legacy as the administrator who got us to the moon? Or is his legacy going to be as an Elon Musk puppet who lost us the moon? And although a great many people are going to vehemently disagree with me in terms of Jared Isaacman losing us the moon if he does decide to go with an exclusively SpaceX solution to get us to the moon, but I'm going to explain in the course of this video why, as Mr. Isaacman comes up against Congress and up against American politics, that if he does indeed decide to shut down this wasteful project that creates so many jobs in so many crucial states, if he shuts this down, throws all those people out of work, and creates many, many enemies in the process, it's not only going to put his tenure as administrator in jeopardy, but everything he tries to accomplish in the next 4 years could very well get reversed the moment Trump leaves office. So for those of you who've been watching my channel for a long time, you'll probably know that this was the moment that my position on SLS started to shift a bit. I practically released negative pieces about SLS every month, sometimes even more frequently than that. The ridiculous expense, every negative report that came from the NASA Office of Inspector General, and all of the delays that happened as we ramped up towards the first launch of SLS, everything was looking so horrible. And frankly, given Boeing's terrible track record at that time, I fully expected this rocket to blow up on the pad or blow up at some point while it was on its way to orbit, something to go seriously wrong. But instead, virtually nothing went wrong. People are making a lot out of the heat shield issues with Orion and other minor factors, but when it comes right down to it, SLS performed spectacularly on its first launch, before Starship had even lifted off from the pad, and Starship did not have nearly as good of a first launch as SLS did. Now, of course, that's to be expected, because SLS was a completed project, something that had reached a full level of maturity. Starship obviously was not, but still, we have had a rocket that is capable of transporting human beings to cislunar space since 2022. The only reasons that Artemis 2 hasn't taken place yet is, number one, NASA's abundance of caution. They want to make sure that they don't lose any astronauts in this early stage of the process, but also, number two, their timetable doesn't really require them to, because once Artemis 2 is done, then landing on the moon is the next step, and Starship, the anointed HLS choice, is nowhere close to being ready to put human beings on the surface of the moon. There are so many steps that still remain before Starship gets from where it is now to being capable of landing on the moon, and therein lies the problem. At what stage is it wise to be canceling SLS when we really don't know when Starship is going to be fully ready to put humans on the surface of the moon, let alone transporting humans all the way from Earth to the moon? Now, Eric Berger, a spaceflight journalist who tends to be right about a great many things, but also, frankly, has a substantial pro-SpaceX bias, has said that SLS has about a 75% chance of being canceled, and being canceled right now. Jared Isaacman believes in Starship implicitly, and I'm sure that he believes that Starship can do the entire job of taking humans from the surface of the Earth all the way to the moon in very short order, possibly in the 4 years before Trump leaves office. Although, I have to admit, if he actually thinks that that's possible, that Starship can do the entire job in such a short amount of time, and also switching up our solution of getting people to the moon this late in the game and somehow making all of that happen by 2028, I think that he is a bit deluded. I'm really hoping that he hasn't drunk Elon's Kool-Aid to that degree. But let's say that he has. Let's say that he's just going to go ahead and shut SLS down the moment he takes the job. His first day on the job, SLS is canceled. What stands in his way of making that happen? Well, first of all, the guy does have to be approved. The Senate has to confirm his appointment. Now, this may just be a rubber stamp process, but it may not, because keep in mind, there are many jobs, mostly in Alabama and Louisiana, but frankly across the entire country, that are going to go away if Jared Isaacman shuts SLS down violently. In other words, a drastic, immediate shutdown of the program. No more money spent on it. We're going to go ahead and just cycle the whole thing down without another rocket ever taking flight. And there are 4 senators in Alabama and Louisiana, all 4 of whom are Republicans, that may not be all that enthusiastic about it. And joining up with all of the Democratic senators who are likely to oppose any appointment that Trump makes right now, I would say that there's a chance that Jared Isaacman is not even going to get confirmed into the position if he takes too radical of a position on SLS. Also, Mr. Isaacman doesn't strike me as the kind of person that's going to tell these senators what they want to hear until he's confirmed and then shut down SLS anyway once he has the job. He just has a greater degree of integrity than that. So I really think that once confronted with the whole SLS issue and asked by these senators as to how many jobs are really going to be lost in their states if he goes forward with his plans, he may not be quite so radical in his solution for SLS, and it might be more of a gradual dialing down of the program rather than putting it on the chopping block immediately. And there's another consideration. Let's say that Isaacman does indeed get confirmed, takes his new job, and then tries to shut SLS down right away. Well, SLS already has its budget for 2025. All of that has already been decided and cannot really be reversed. Isaacman does not have the flexibility to take the billions of dollars that have already been earmarked for SLS and then shift it right into Starship without facing the wrath of Congress. And it's also worth noting that in the 2025 budget, SLS is actually dropped by $200 million in terms of overall NASA spending because the development part of SLS is essentially over, or largely over, and now we're shifting into production, which is, by definition, less expensive than development. Actually, the cost for Orion has gone down as well, whereas the money going into HLS, in other words, Starship, and also, of course, the Blue Origin Blue Moon, that has actually gone up in the 2025 budget. So probably that budget is going to have to play out, and everything that is at least currently planned for SLS under that budget is also going to play out, and that may include the launch of Artemis 2. I think it would be a huge mistake to shut SLS down a few months prior to the flight of Artemis 2, and to tell those 4 astronauts who have been so looking forward to becoming the first Americans to travel into cislunar space in over half a century, including the first woman, the first black man, the first Canadian. Do Canadians count as a minority? Well, yeah, sure they do. Anyway, to tell these folks that they aren't going to the moon after all, tough luck, better luck next time, whatever. That, I think, would be a horrible moment for NASA, a moment that would be difficult to get over in terms of morale, in terms of perception. I mean, think about it. We're talking about a billionaire who's been to space a couple of times, yes, and has accomplished some things, but someone who has not sacrificed nearly as much of his life for the human experience in space as these 4 people have, telling them all of a sudden, well, you don't get to go to the moon because we're switching over to a system that my buddy Elon is providing. Somehow, I don't see that going over very well in terms of public perception. But what happens if they simply allow Artemis 2 to go forward and then cancel the project after that? Well, what happens if Artemis 2 goes almost as flawlessly or even more flawlessly than Artemis 1 did? What happens if those astronauts carry out a successful orbit of the moon? We get to see all of their incredible experiences in real time, and then Orion brings them safely back. They tell their stories to the media, President Trump, who's going to be, I think, very happy to be basking in the limelight and waiting perhaps for the next moment of mankind setting foot on the moon. He'd love to make that same call that Nixon did in 1969. How do you then say, well, you know, this rocket that got these astronauts out to the moon, well, we're not going to be using that anymore. Instead, we're going to go ahead and use Starship, which just carried out its first refueling experiments in orbit, but hasn't been out to the moon yet. Not really sure when it's actually going to be ready to get to the moon, but it will eventually, really it will, and so we're going to go ahead and shut down this particular rocket that did the job in the hopes that this other rocket that Elon's got is going to do the job instead. And hopefully it will all get done, Mr. President, before you leave office in 3 years. I'm not entirely certain that Trump would be all that enthusiastic to roll the dice on that, especially immediately after SLS has successfully brought the astronauts out to lunar orbit and back without any significant problems. This, of course, assumes that there aren't any significant problems. If there are, then yeah, all bets are off. But if SLS does the same job for Artemis 2 as it did for Artemis 1, then yeah, I think it's going to be a little difficult to justify taking the chance on an unproven system to do the job afterwards, although it is still very possible. Let's say that that is what happens. Let's say that Artemis 2 does indeed carry out its job and then SLS gets shut down afterwards. Well, here's another problem. Any plan that Jared Isaacman proposes has to be approved by Congress. They control the purse string. So if he shuts SLS down and the roughly $2 billion going to SLS as well, that means that all of the House of Representatives, or at least a majority of representatives in the House, are going to have to okay that, including the 13 representatives, most of whom are Republicans from Louisiana and Alabama, whose constituents are going to suffer as a result of that decision. We're talking lots and lots of jobs, not just the people who are actually engaged in the construction of SLS, but also everybody who supports them, the various businesses that provide services for those employees of NASA. I mean, we're talking a big industry in Alabama and Louisiana that's been there for a long time, since the time of the space shuttle actually, that's engaged in the construction of SLS. SLS, we're going to be talking about thousands of lost jobs and billions of dollars in lost revenue to those states, with the money saved presumably being invested in new jobs in Texas, and only Texas, because SpaceX centralizes all of their work in one location. One of the reasons that they are so successful and they are so efficient, but at the same time, not very politically desirable to shift money from a bunch of states into just one, especially states where these jobs have been in place for decades. This industry has been in place for decades. Again, keep in mind, these are the same people that used to build core stages for the space shuttle. There's really no difference in terms of the work that they used to do compared to the work that they do now for SLS. So we're talking a very long-standing industry being wiped out and Congress having to approve that. Again, given how closely divided Congress is, with only a few representatives between the Democrats and the Republicans at the moment, I'm not sure if that kind of budget would actually get approved. We can count on all the Democratic representatives to vote against a Trump budget, and if only 3 or 4 Republican representatives from Louisiana and Alabama were to jump ship in order to protect jobs in their state, well, there goes your NASA budget, and things would have to change. And there is, of course, one more problem, one that could very well sabotage or destroy Jared Isaacman's legacy. If he does indeed shift everything over to Starship, or perhaps another solution like using Falcon Heavy to take Orion to orbit and then using a Centaur 5 to push Orion the rest of the way to the moon, either solution is going to require a big change in engineering, human rating a bunch of rockets that aren't currently human rated, essentially a radical change in plan, and making all of that happen in the next 4 years in time for humanity to actually set foot on the moon again. If they fail to do that, number one, of course, Trump won't actually get to see astronauts set foot on the moon again while he's still in office. He won't get to make that Nixon phone call. That, I think, will aggravate him tremendously. But in addition to that, the next president to take over, especially if that president is a Democrat, will have a very strong case that Jared Isaacman shifted money and important projects over to his good friend Elon Musk and spent billions of taxpayer dollars and failed to get to the moon in the process. And they would have a lot of justification to condemn everything Isaacman had tried to do as being corrupt and canceling it all, of course. And in the process, we would lose the moon. China would definitely make it to the moon before the United States did, and if we had to start over yet again after a Starship solution was canceled, well, that would pretty much be the end of the game. So when it comes right down to it, if Jared Isaacman really wants to do his job responsibly, that is to say, if he wants to get humanity, or get Americans anyway, back to the lunar surface within the next 4 years while his boss, Donald Trump, is still in office, about the least responsible thing he could do right now would be to cancel the one rocket that's capable right now of taking humans to cislunar space. Nothing else that we're working on at the moment is actually capable of getting humans out to the moon except for SLS. This is the one piece of Artemis that, inefficient and as expensive as it is, it currently works. It seems to work pretty damn well. This would be about as silly as canceling Saturn V after it made its first unmanned flight, hoping that we could put another solution in place before the end of the decade. A plan that definitely would have failed back then, and it will fail now as well if we try it at this late stage. If we wanted to cancel SLS, the right time to do it was back in 2020 when Bridenstine was still administrator. It's too late for us to be changing horses now. We need to push forward with what we have and then transition over when Starship is truly ready. And I hope that Jared Isaacman has the wisdom to realize that. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, please consider supporting this channel on Patreon and PayPal. I'd like to thank new Patreon members Paul Grand, Max Casas, and finally Charlie Schmidt. Thank you very much for supporting this channel. If you'd like to join these folks, all the details are in the description. Until next time, stay angry about space.